Well, yeah, we're going to let you know that we are going to record the tonight's program. In a chance you don't like to be recorded or consent to it, then you can leave the meeting. But obviously, we hope very much that you won't, that you'll stay and be part of the festivities. Anyway, we're delighted to welcome Dr. Brooke Bateman, who I will note right at the beginning is a board member, an important board member of Full Harbors Audubon. But some of you may know her as the Director of Climate Science with the National Audubon Society. And in that role, she collaborates with scientists, volunteers, and Audubon's Climate Initiative team to develop research focused on climate and the conservation of birds in the places that need today and in the future. In this role, she led a team of scientists in developing Survival by Degrees, 389 bird species on the brink, Audubon's 2019 Birds and Climate Change Report. As Director of Climate Watch, which you may be familiar with the Climate Watch program, and it's an important program that involves citizen science, tracking birds' response to climate change. She works with community volunteers to understand how climate change currently affects birds in North America. Her research focuses on spatial ecology and conservation and emphasizes the effect that extreme weather events and climate change have on biodiversity. Brooke works closely with on-the-ground practitioners and stakeholders to link climate research to on-the-ground conservation and management actions. Before joining the Audubon science team in 2016, Brooke conducted postdoctoral research on the influence of climate and weather on birds and marsupials with James Cook University, the University of Tasmania in Australia. She also served as a postdoctoral associate at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and later as an assistant scientist at a NASA project researching how extreme weather events affect birds. Brooke received her PhD in zoology and tropical ecology at James Cook University in Australia in 2010, a graduate diploma of research methods from James Cook University in 2006, and a Bachelor of Science cum laude from Boston College in 2003. Brooke enjoys hiking, drawing, yoga, and not surprisingly, birding with her daughter. Her favorite bird, she says, is the common loon, which is very disappointing since she really should like the common nighthawk the best, we think. Anyway, it's my pleasure to introduce Brooke Bateman to you, who is going to provide a very informative program about birds and climate change. Brooke?
Thanks, John. And I'm really happy to be here tonight. And thank you all for joining for the presentation. Just give me a moment to share my screen. Great. So I'm going to talk to you today. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about how birds are telling us it's time to take action on climate change, talk a little bit about climate change and how it's affecting birds. And then I'm going to switch gears and talk about a solution, a potential solution that could kind of benefit birds and climate change stabilization, natural climate solutions.
Brooke, I'm sorry, I meant to say with regard to questions, we're going to wait to the end. So if you hold your questions, if you'd be so kind as just to put your questions in the chat room, we'll get to them at the end. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that would be fantastic. Thanks, John. So I want to sort of start by saying that we're in the midst of a climate crisis. The average temperatures across the globe have risen since pre-industrial averages of up to 1.1 degrees Celsius warmer than they were from the baseline. And this is dangerously close to the internationally agreed limit of 1.5 degrees Celsius that was agreed upon in the Paris Agreement. And this is just an animation where you can really see the temperature anomalies and how things are getting hotter the further we get in the 2000s. Here's a plot looking at the 10 hottest global temperatures on record, and the top 10 hottest years on record have all occurred in the last 12 years. And you can really see that we're sort of in the midst of this complete climate crisis moving forward. I do want to highlight, though, that climate change has happened before. This is not a new phenomenon. The Earth has moved in and out of ice ages before over the past million years. And the global temperatures have risen a total of 4 to 7 degrees Celsius in the past. But historically, this has happened over about a 5,000-year time frame. In the past century alone, the temperature has climbed, as I said, that 1.1 degrees Celsius, roughly 10 times faster than any average rate of ice age recovery warming that we've seen before. And then looking forward, models predict that the Earth will warm between 2 to 6 degrees Celsius in the next century alone. And this is at a rate of 20 times faster than has happened before. So this really is an unprecedented and unusual rate of change. And one of the things that comes up, because I talk a lot about birds and climate change, is, well, yeah, birds have dealt with climate change before. We've had climate change before. Why is this different? And this alarming rate of climate change, that 20 times faster than we've ever seen before, is a big part of the issue, because it's happening so fast. It's really hard for biodiversity to cope and sort of adapt at a short time scale to the amount of warming that we're seeing. We're also in the midst of a biodiversity crisis. Since 1970, we know that we've lost 1 in 4 birds. We already know that birds are having their challenges, that 3 billion fewer birds occur in North America than they did in that time frame. And part of this has to do with changes in the landscape that people have contributed to. So when we look at housing density across the US and how that's changed through time, I'm just sort of going to cycle through these maps so you can get a kind of impression of how much the landscape has changed since even just 1940. Here you can see a map. The darker green areas indicate more natural areas, red and yellow are more urban areas, and it's just an indication of housing density. And you can see as I cycle through the time periods, just decade by decade, how much these urban areas are expanding and how much these natural areas we're actually losing. And so this is up to the 2000s, 2010 and 20 predictions to 2030. So you can see a dramatic change in just the United States in that time period. And so it's going to get potentially worse. But another thing, going back to that question about, will birds have coped with climate change before? Yes, they have at a much different rate. But also when they were navigating and having to kind of adapt to this newer landscape, they were coming up against natural native grasslands and intact forest systems. And so when we look at the paleo record, historically, the response that we see across most species is that they shift their range. And so they move where they live to sort of keep pace with the climate conditions that they're used to, and essentially move across the landscape to kind of find new areas to sort of survive in. And so they had this natural landscape that was allowing them to sort of shift and find these new places and still find natural habitats. But because of that land use change that I was highlighting before, what they're finding now, instead of native grasslands, one of the most imperiled ecosystems in the US and in the world, we're finding agriculture, just mass agriculture replacing our native grasslands. And some places where we used to have intact forests or more natural vegetation, we're having that increase in housing density. So they have this sort of double whammy of having to deal with the rapid pace of climate change, as well as these altered habitats. And a study that we just put out in this year, actually a couple of months ago, we can highlight how the dual crises of climate change and biodiversity loss are already shaping where birds occur in the eastern US. And so here we use the Christmas bird count data. Christmas bird count is over 100-year-old program where volunteers go out and count birds around the Christmas period and the winter period every year. And it's really starting to like from 1900 onward, we're really trying to understand how birds are affected by climate change. But when we look at the combination of climate change and land use change, what we're seeing is that that's really shaping where these birds occur. And so for woodpeckers, they're really shifting northward and being affected by both climate and land use change. And what we found was that climate consistently limits these winter edges of where these species can occur, the edge of their ranges. And as things get warmer, they're able to sort of shift into these areas that used to be much colder. But where they occur on a given location is more affected by land use change. And so the combination of the two is dictating where we see birds across the US. And so because of this, we like to say that birds are messengers of their environment and what's going on in their environment. Because birds are so intimately tied to the world around them, we can look to them as messengers to see what things are changing in our world and what we can sort of understand about climate change. And so a couple of the things and sort of patterns that we're starting to see around climate change with birds is, one thing is we're seeing changes in egg laying dates. And so on a large scale study showed that birds are on average across multiple species laying their eggs up to 7 days earlier per decade. North American tree swallows are nesting up to 9 days earlier than they were 30 years ago. And a study that just came out this week shows that some birds up to 30 days earlier are nesting now. And so they're actually shifting when they're actually laying their eggs to cope with the fact that spring has become warmer. And one study in California actually showed that the timing of the birds shifting their range, when they're laying their eggs, actually coincides with the amount of temperature difference that we've seen in the last century. So that 1.1 degrees Celsius I've talked about, birds are actually nesting earlier because it's that amount cooler. So they've sort of adjusted where they're laying in time to account for those temperature changes. Other species like the bald eagle in the Midwest are nesting up to 6 weeks earlier than they did. And that's because of the reduced extent of the ice cover in the Great Lakes region and in the rivers because of those warmer winters. And they're able to get more food resources earlier than they used to, and therefore they're able to initiate nesting earlier. A really interesting study is that birds' body sizes are actually changing. And so a couple of studies have looked at this recently through museum records of birds that they've had over a long time period. And what they found is that birds are actually getting smaller and their wings are getting longer. And the hypothesis is that birds that are smaller in body are better able to dissipate heat. And so there's a theory called Bergman's rule, where the closer you are to the equator, the smaller you are for this reason. And the further you away are, the more bigger your body is so that you can cope with more cold. And so what we're seeing across the board are these sort of shrinking birds to cope with the amount of climate change that we're experiencing. A recent study kind of looked at that a little bit more in depth, and what they found was that bird species that have bigger brains are actually not shrinking at the same rate, and they're staying a little bit larger than these other birds. And the theory there is that they might be able to find microclimates or different ways to adapt to the changing climate as opposed to just shrinking their body size. Birds are also migrating earlier, and particularly in spring. Some species like the Wilson's warbler are arriving up to multiple days earlier than they used to due to climate change. And a broad scale study looked across multiple species using something called radar ecology. So the sort of the Doppler radar that you use to get your weather and your rainfall pattern actually has what they used to think was noise in the background signal. And when they looked a little bit closer at it, they figured out that it wasn't actually noise. It was the pulse of either birds or insects taking off at night during migration or big swarming events. And so you can actually see this sort of pulse, this fingerprint of when and where birds are migrating. And you can sort of use that to understand how they kind of shift through the landscape to migrate. And what we found that up to 2 days a decade across multiple species, we're seeing these shifts in migration. And this can be problematic, especially if a bird is not arriving on the breeding grounds at the right time. So if the winters are getting more mild and spring is sort of happening earlier, global insect phenology, so like when the plants start growing their vegetation out and their leaves start leaving out, and then the insects come out at that point, that's when you have a high abundance of caterpillars. And 96% of land birds feed caterpillars to their young. So if the insects are shifting earlier, but the birds not sort of arriving at the right time and they're not laying their eggs at the right time, that peak abundance of when the caterpillars are available is not going to coincide when they have their nestlings. And that can be really problematic for population and survival of their young. And also if there's a warm winter followed by a cold snap, that can also affect caterpillar abundance because cold snaps can kill insects and vegetation, again, causing these mismatches with the birds and when they're actually breeding. Ecological communities are also becoming completely disrupted. This is an image of actually thousands of common murres, which are seabirds washed up dead on the beaches of Alaska. And we've seen several more of these seabird die-offs recently, and these used to happen every once in a while, and now they're happening more commonly. And what this is related to is that we're actually having a lot more marine heat waves. These are images from 2 different heat waves that they called the blob, which are just really warm temperatures off the western coast of the US. And we're having many more of these. And what happens with these heat waves is that it actually affects the fish population. And so the fish that these birds normally eat are trying to avoid these temperatures. They either don't move into these areas or they dive down really deep. And it's so deep that these birds can't actually dive down to get their food. So all these birds are actually starving due to these heat waves. And lastly, we know that birds are shifting their ranges due to climate change. Like I said, this is sort of the historical response that we've seen, and this is also what we're seeing now. The top two birds are the Carolina wren and the chipping sparrow. These are two species that we've seen shift their range in winter. They're the smaller bodied southern species that have done well as winters have warmed. They've actually been able to expand their range. Normally, they would have gotten knocked back in their population sizes by really cold winters, but since that's not happening, they're able to sort of establish themselves in these areas. The hooded warbler and the rusty blackbird are two species that have changed their distribution in the breeding season. Hooded warblers have been shown to have expanded their range quite a bit with changes in climate in the breeding season, whereas rusty blackbird has actually contracted its range. It's lost whole southern part of its range. It's shifted 120 kilometers northward due to climate change and the southern part of its range becoming no longer suitable. Again, we're also seeing shifts in widespread species. I just wanted to highlight again how the Christmas bird count data that I know some of you on this webinar today actually participate in and contribute data to, so thank you. We're really learning fantastic things from this, including species like the hairy woodpecker on the left and the white-crowned sparrow on the right. Where we're seeing lower numbers of these species in the south, in the red areas, and more of them in the north and the blue areas. And that's directly related to these changes in winter temperatures. So that's sort of what we've seen about birds are telling us what's happened with climate change that we've already experienced. And I like to say that because I like to talk about that because climate change is not just a future problem, it's an issue that's happening now. And we're currently already seeing this through the way that birds are telling us that things are changing in our landscape. But we have a lot of kind of work to do if we want to prevent this from getting worse in the future and seeing more additional changes. We're currently on a path to a much higher amount of warming in the future if we don't take action on climate change. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about how birds are potentially going to be affected if we don't do anything. Because as I said, we are already in this biodiversity crisis where we've lost 3 billion birds. So we're not starting from like a clean slate. And climate change can be seen as a threat multiplier. It's going to make any issue exacerbated and worse. And so we put out a report in 2019, Survival by Degrees. And I'm just going to give a little bit of context about the report and give you some findings. But first off, we like to kind of put the work that we're doing in relation to some of the policy work that's happening globally. So there is a scientific consensus that we need to limit global temperatures to 2 degrees Celsius above that pre-industrial average to avoid what we call a climate tipping point. And that's really a critical threshold, which beyond that would really dramatic and detrimental changes that are irreversible to the system for birds, for biodiversity, potentially causing us to lose 1 billion more birds and have more climate crises to deal with. Currently, we've experienced, as I said earlier, about that 1 degree, the 1.1 degrees. 1.5 degrees is the goal from the Paris Agreement, and that is sort of the best case scenario at this point, and it's slowly becoming hard to actually get to that point. But we really need to take immediate and aggressive action if we want to get to that point. And so there's also the 2 degrees Celsius, which I said is that tipping point, and where we kind of hope that we can stabilize things and not go beyond that. But what we really need to focus on is where we're headed. And so currently, the pledges and targets. And so pledges and targets are what different countries have said that they are going to do, what they're committing to in the Paris Agreement. And so if we look at just the pledges and the targets, we are only going to get to about 3 degrees Celsius. But then if we actually look at the policies that are currently in place, it's even a little bit worse than that. So we're clearly not doing enough, and we're not committed to doing enough to get where we need to be to stabilize climate change. I also wanted to kind of, I feel like when we say 1 degree, 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, 3 degrees, what does that mean, global temperature? How does that relate to me? So one thing I wanted to highlight is that those temperatures, when translated locally, can mean something a lot different. And if we look at the US, at 2 degrees Celsius and at 3 degrees Celsius in particular, A 3 degrees Celsius global warming scenario actually is closer to 3.8 degrees Celsius in Chicago. So across the US in general, it means much warmer temperatures than that global average. And how does that feel for New York? The climate in 2080 would feel more like the climate in Jonesboro, Arkansas. And so that's a place that in summer is typically almost a little over 9 degrees Fahrenheit warmer and much drier than New York in the summer. So lots of potential changes of just how the climate feels in that time period. So Survive by Degrees took these different scenarios to try to understand how birds would be potentially affected if we continue on the path that we're on. And this is looking at one species. This is looking at the wood thrush. And so the wood thrush, we have models that sort of estimate the current range for that species. And then we have projections of how climate and vegetation could potentially change in the future under different climate change scenarios. We have a 1.5 degree scenario and a 3 degree scenario, and areas in red are areas that we're anticipating to see range loss, meaning those areas will become no longer suitable based on temperature, precipitation factors, vegetation. And then we have blue areas that the species could potentially move into because the climate conditions and the vegetation could be getting better, but it's a bit of a gamble because we don't know if those areas actually have the right microclimates or the right food sources or the things at the local scale that the birds need to survive. And then we have stable conditions that can be anywhere from worsening in orange to improving in green, but still within the sort of range of values that are sort of okay for these species in these different seasons. And what we can see is there's a difference at the 1.5 degree scenario. There is some range loss, but this species is considered low vulnerability to climate change. It doesn't have a huge amount of range loss. However, at 3 degrees Celsius, we see a large and dramatic amount of range loss, and this species is now considered highly vulnerable to climate change. So in this report, we looked at 605 species and sort of assessed these changes in range based on climate, vegetation at different scenarios. And what we found was that 2/3 of birds in North America are at risk of large amounts of range loss, potentially extinction or local extinction because of climate change. And this is if we do nothing to take action against climate change. Just to sort of put some faces to species that could be at risk, these are just a small sample of species that are climate vulnerable that are also already of conservation concern. So these are those species that are being hit by that dual biodiversity crisis, climate crisis, because they're already struggling with their population. Some of these are endangered species. And then they're going to be having large amounts of range loss potentially with climate change, including species that we know and love here in New York. I do want to also highlight that forest birds are definitely at risk. 65% of the species that occur in our area within forests are vulnerable to climate change. And you can see here, this is sort of a map of how many of the species in that group are vulnerable to climate change, with red and orange being our vulnerable groups and blue and yellow being non-vulnerable. And you can see that 98% of our boreal, 86% of our western forests, and then 71 and 59% of our subtropical and eastern forests. So lots of vulnerability for these birds moving forward. And these are birds that have already seen dramatic losses and declines since 1970. 9 in 10 of our evening grosbeaks, 6 in 10 of our wood thrush. And I know like wood thrush is one of my favorite calls to hear when I'm out on Long Island, and I know there are not as many places as there used to be that you can hear them. Coastal birds are also vulnerable to climate change, over 50% of their population. And I do want to sort of highlight that one of our beloved species on Long Island, the piping plover, is predicted to lose 100% of its range in the area under the high climate scenario. And this species is also potentially affected by extreme weather events in these areas that it occurs in, including heat waves, heavy rainfall events, increased urbanization, and sea level rise. But when we looked at the different climate change scenarios, what we saw is that if we take action and stabilize things at that 1.5 degrees Celsius, then 76% of those species are better off, meaning they have a lot less range loss and drop down a vulnerability category, with some of them up to 40% of them actually becoming no longer suitable. And this is true also for the piping plover at that 1.5 degrees Celsius. There are still plenty of areas on Long Island that are considered stable. Still not the best picture, but still some areas where it could persist. So that's sort of like highlighting the issues and how birds are potentially affected by climate change. And I want to kind of switch gears to more solutions and understanding where we can go. But the takeaway from understanding this is that we need to do two different things. First, we need to protect places birds need now and into the future. And this is what we call climate adaptation. And it's really building resilience into the landscape, into our habitats, into our systems, because there is going to be, and already has been, an inevitable amount of climate change that we're not going to escape. This is going to happen. So we really need to kind of do what we can to improve the landscape so that we can hope that they will do better. In addition, we also have to do what we call climate mitigation, which is really addressing the root causes of climate change, which is greenhouse gas emissions. And so we also, yes, we have to take personal actions, but we really need to urge action at the state and federal levels to take more action there. And what does that look like? In order to get where we need to go by 2030, we need to be emitting 45% less by 2030 and zero of that by 2010. So we really need to go to net zero emissions by 2010. In New York, our climate policy is pretty good compared to some other states. And this is just sort of a breakdown of where our electricity comes from, what the targets are. And I do want to highlight that what I said on the previous slide, we need to get to 45% by 2030, and we need to get to net zero or 100% emissions reductions by 2050. We're close to New York, but we're not quite there. There's still a good chunk of things that we need to do. And I think that we need to sort of consider what are some other actions we can take to sort of urge policy makers in New York to do more to get closer to where we need to be on climate change. So one of the things that is sort of highlighted and more recently has become well known is that previous policies have sort of tackled these two crises separately and tackled biodiversity loss and climate change problems independently of each other. And what we know now is that these two things are very intertwined and they're the most pressing issues of our time. And so we really can't afford to look at them separately because they really do sort of connect with each other. And if we ignore one, we could take risk of taking actions that inadvertently prevent the solutions of the other. And so we really need to pull together to address them both at once. And that's where we talk about natural climate solutions, is the ability to sort of provide a path for both that climate adaptation, that building the resilience, and the climate mitigation. So addressing the root cause of climate change. And that will help with the biodiversity crisis as well as with the climate crisis, because by restoring these ecosystems, it really helps species, it limits biodiversity loss, and it's really a win-win solution for sort of both of them. So why carbon? So carbon is really important. It is not, when you look at across the greenhouse gases, so we have carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and fluorinated gases. Carbon dioxide and the amount of heat each gas traps in the atmosphere, carbon dioxide is the least sort of heat trapping in relativity to the others, and fluorinated gases are the much higher. But the amount of greenhouse gases that contribute to the total emissions around the globe, carbon dioxide makes up 76% of it. So it's the largest percentage by a lot. And the really important thing is that it sticks around for a really long time. Once it's emitted in the atmosphere, 40% still remains after 100 years, 20% remains after 1,000 years, and around 10% can last 10,000 years or longer. And so we really need to address this and keep carbon out of the atmosphere where we can and try to pull it out as fast as we can, because it just really has such an impact on our greenhouse gas profile. And that's where we can turn to natural systems. And so this is an example of carbon storage. Carbon storage in some places are called irrecoverable carbon, because if we lose the carbon that's stored in our natural systems and release it into the atmosphere, it would not be able to be recovered in a time frame that was meaningful for climate action. And so where we have high carbon stocks or carbon storage or carbon pools, we need to keep it. And so this is just, again, an example from forests where we can see that we have a large amount of carbon storage in the living biomass. So where the trees are growing, their trunks, their leaves, But we also have a large percentage in organic soil matter underground. So that's sort of like where our big carbon powerhouses are in forested systems, with a smaller amount in the deadwood and the litter. But forests and systems like this that hold carbon are really important to protect for that reason of how well that they really store carbon. So carbon storage is sort of measured as this like total amount that is in the system, whereas carbon sequestration is how much that system is changing every year. And so we have carbon coming into the system as plants are growing, and we have carbon coming out of the system as plants are being cut down or no longer growing. And so what we are kind of looking at is that forests can act as both a source and a sink. A source is where you're emitting more carbon than you're pulling into your system. So you're putting more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And a carbon sink is where you're pulling more carbon into the system than you're emitting. So we need more carbon sinks with climate change to help mitigate climate change. And I do want to just sort of highlight, I don't want to get into the details of this figure, but it's definitely more than just forests. We need to look across all of our ecosystems to really kind of get at where we can use the natural system to help store that carbon and where it's already doing well. So our oceans are a big part of that. I'm not going to talk a lot about the oceans today, but it is a really big part of the natural climate solutions story, as well as our inland systems. And then again, harvesting wood or cutting down forests or burning fossil fuels are really where we're going to see a lot of our carbon loss from these systems. So natural climate solutions are defined as actions that maintain through protection and sustainably management of ecosystems, as well as restoration of ecosystems in a way that mitigate climate change through the natural ability of these soils and plants to absorb and store carbon. And these actions you can see here are sort of defined across different systems by protecting forests and wetlands and grasslands, managing our forests and our working lands better, and restoring areas like forests and wetlands that have been degraded. And these natural systems already provide the solutions we need to fight climate change, but we need to kind of identify that they're proven and available now and they're cost effective so that we can take action. So I do want to kind of bring this sort of figure back where it looks at kind of where we need to go in terms of carbon emissions. We have sort of our historic emissions and our trajectory if we stay on business as usual. But we do have to do kind of this dual approach of reducing what is going out in the atmosphere, which is called fossil fuel mitigation. So that's really trying to limit how much carbon goes into the atmosphere. So that would be switching to alternative energy sources. But natural climate solutions, we can't ignore them. They can provide roughly a third of the climate action we need by 2030. And as I said, they're available and proven now. And there's a growing understanding that we can't limit the rise of global temperatures below 2 degrees Celsius and achieve net zero without major investments in natural climate solutions. So natural climate solutions in the US, there are different potential across different ecosystems. And I do want to say that this figure from Fargione et al. Is not adjusted for area. So this is just looking at total carbon storage. It's not looking at sequestration. It's not looking, well, it's looking at sequestration, but it's not looking at it per unit area. But across the board, some of the best solutions to reduce carbon emissions are the landscapes that actively clean our air and our water and naturally store carbon. And so forests by far store the biggest climate mitigation potential across all systems in terms of how much total carbon it can store. But grasslands and wetlands are also really important. And I do want to highlight again that there are other benefits to air, biodiversity, soil, and water for each of these natural climate solutions. So there's, again, back to that win-win of these different solutions. So we understand that we need to maintain these areas that are doing well for natural climate solutions to areas that are already storing carbon and pulling more carbon out of the atmosphere. And we need to do that through protection and management, but we also need to restore areas that could really help sort of benefit birds in this anthropogenic and altered landscape. And so we need to understand where are the areas that we could sort of put these efforts on the ground. And so we put a report out on natural climate solutions and the ecosystems that we focused within the United States We looked across the US and Alaska. We looked at forests, we looked at grasslands and rangelands. We looked at interior wetlands, we looked at coastal areas, we looked at arid lands and shrublands. We also looked at urban and suburban systems because there are, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, lots of things you can do in these ecosystems where people live that can help benefit. As well as Alaska, we looked at several different ecosystems in Alaska. And I'm happy to share this report if anybody is interested. So across the US, we decided to map these areas that were important, and we sort of broke it down to areas that we want to maintain. These are areas that are important for biodiversity and carbon through protection and management. And then we also identified areas to restore. And so our areas to maintain, and I'm going to go through what each of these means. We mapped out areas that we're calling climate strongholds for birds. And these are areas that I'll talk about how they're important for birds now and into the future. And then also we wanted to identify areas that are high in carbon storage and are actively pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. And so first are climate strongholds. Climate strongholds are areas that have high climate suitability for species now and into the future under climate change, but they also have relatively less human modification. And so these are really the areas that we're sort of identifying as the best places for birds as sort of refuge from the biodiversity and climate crises. And we wanted to sort of identify where these locations are. So what we did, and just sort of circling back to our Survive by Degrees report, we have these maps of current and future potential range of these birds under climate scenarios. So we pull all this information together across multiple species. And so for example, I'm just using an example for our forest strongholds here. We took the present distribution and ranges of these species, the future range of these species for 287 forest species across the East and the West to understand where these places are. And so the map you're looking at are climate strongholds for forest systems, and areas in dark green are those areas that are really, really important for birds now and will continue to be important for them under climate change. We also have the light green areas, which are also really important. So we're calling those our supporting strongholds, but we really wanted to map out where are the key areas that we need to think about either maintaining or conserving because they're going to be important for these birds as they're having to navigate these changes in climate. So pairing with the bird information, our biodiversity information, we want to pair that carbon data. And so what we did is we mapped across the US these areas that have really high carbon storage, but are also actively pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. So these are our carbon sinks. These are our forests that are pulling carbon as they grow in their systems. And they're really important because they're acting in a way that is going to help us with climate change. And so we mapped these areas and how they aligned across the US. You can see here, the areas in green are the areas that are high value for both birds and carbon. So these are the priority areas across forests in the US that we want to maintain through protection, through sustainable management practices to help us address climate change and biodiversity loss. We also understand that there are areas that we want to restore. And so what we're looking at are vulnerable climate strongholds. And I'm going to talk about the carbon next, but our vulnerable climate strongholds are essentially areas that could be important for birds today under climate change, but they've been exposed to high amounts of human modification. So if you go back to that housing density map that I talked about earlier, we're looking at areas that have been highly modified by people. We've used an integrity index in the forests as well as a human modification index to sort of map out where are these areas that could be good for birds if they were restored to their natural system. And then we paired that with what we're calling potential carbon sinks. And so these are areas that over time have acted important in terms of carbon storage and sequestration, but that they have a high amount of disturbance because of human modification. And so these are our priority areas to restore that align with areas that are degraded and could be doing better, or young areas that are still pulling carbon, but as they grow, they'll continue to grow carbon. And so these are the areas we've identified for restoration opportunities. Again, the dark green is the overlap between the two. And just sort of to bring it back, we looked across multiple habitats. It wasn't just forests. We looked at grasslands, wetlands, both interior and coastal, cities and urban areas. And this is just sort of a snapshot. The areas in green are areas to maintain, and the areas in blue are areas that we need to prioritize for restoration. And many of these regions provide critical habitat for birds. Again, they're also important for storing carbon. And combined, these habitats store over 100 billion tons of carbon. And if the human disturbance is minimized, they have the potential to pull twice as much carbon per year than they currently do. And so these systems are really providing a lot of benefits and could potentially continue to provide more benefits, up to 23% of our commitment to the Paris Agreement, if we maintain these through management and protection and restore these areas. So some examples of what we can do for some of the different systems. For forests, we can look at forest protection. This is really important for that carbon that we need to keep in the system, that irrecoverable carbon, including avoiding forest conversion. There's also natural forest management that we can take up, working with foresters to adopt practices that work within forested systems that benefit both birds and carbon, and will reduce the disturbance in these areas. We can actively plant native trees and put in long-term habitat management, and also think about our wildflower management in ways that is best for maintaining carbon and biodiversity. And this, as I said earlier, 65% of our forest birds are vulnerable to climate change. Reforestation will provide early successional forests for birds like the American woodcock and the wood thrush. And protection of mature forests will benefit species like the black-throated blue warbler. So again, sort of tying those two together, the climate and the biodiversity benefits. Obviously, we live on Long Island, so we have a lot of coastline. Coasts are actually one of the most important habitats when we look at the amount of carbon storage and sequestration they do per acre. So not just the totals, but what they do, they sort of there's a lot of bang for their buck in a small amount of area. So we really need to restore coastal wetlands with native plants and natural hydrology. Really think about how to address for the potential of how sea level rise might be affecting these marshes and the seagrasses. We need to avoid coastal wetland conversion. We have a lot of human and coastal development. So figuring out where we can sort of prevent that from happening further, where we can't restore, we can also restore areas where we can't do that. Reducing anthropogenic nutrient inputs and thinking about things like living shorelines, which is trying to stabilize the shores from soil erosion and flooding to improve coastal resilience. And coastal wetland natural climate solutions, as I said, they really pack a big carbon mitigation punch. They store more carbon per acre than any other ecosystem, but they could store 2.5 times more carbon per year if we do restoration efforts in these areas. And so they do provide a lot of opportunity, particularly in a coastal place like Long Island. And restoration of coastal wetlands will build resilience against sea level rise and flooding events for birds like the salt marsh sparrow. Natural climate solutions are also, as I said, urban and suburban systems offer a lot of opportunities. And I think that we have a lot of opportunities even with our own backyards and our neighborhoods to think about urban green spaces and having native plant gardens, as well as composting. There's a lot of things that we can do in our urban and suburban systems. This is an example of the High Line in New York City, where native plant restoration has been put throughout the whole park. Just turning a little bit to a local focus, New York has 14 million acres within priority areas to maintain, and 7 million acres within priority areas to restore. And it does store quite a lot of carbon. New York State has a lot of wonderful forests in the northern part of the state, sequestering over 5 million tons of carbon per year on average. So really they're doing a great job in parts of the state, but there are definitely opportunities. Just to highlight where this is across all the different systems, but there are opportunities for conservation and sustainable management for priority areas to maintain on Long Island. And this is just a map showing some of those areas. And we also have a lot of opportunity for restoration. Again, some of our wetland areas for identifying areas that we can restore. I do want to highlight also that I've been talking a lot about climate and I've been talking a lot about biodiversity, and I haven't really been talking a lot about people, but obviously where we share the landscape with people, and acknowledging that we have changed the landscape a lot and we've caused harm to natural areas and to biodiversity. But we also need to think about how climate change and biodiversity loss are related to people, and understanding that climate justice is affecting some groups and some social areas different than others. And so starting to kind of think about how we can use natural climate solutions to benefit biodiversity and climate change, but also to think about people as well. Just sort of an example, in the Northeast, we're projected to have much more heavy precipitation events in the future. With climate change, we're going to be having just like more daily deluges of rainfall events. And the supercharged water cycle is just leading to these precipitation events. On the flip side, it can also lead to more drying events in other parts of the country. But here we're going to be seeing more. And we've already seen a lot more wet areas in the Northeast. This is for New York City. This is the amount of rainfall that falls on the wettest calendar day each year. We've already seen a dramatic increase, as well as increases with warmer oceans and warmer atmospheres. Rising seas come together to make hurricanes more destructive, heavier rainfall events, and higher storm surge. And I just want to highlight the storm that just happened this year. Well, I guess it was last year, but in the fall, the remnants of Ida really smashed the previous rainfall records for New York City. It had the single night rainfall totals surpass monthly averages in many parts of the region. And so it was just really impressive how much rainfall fell within a given hour. And these areas in red and orange saw, well, like I said, in one night, more rainfall than they usually see on average in a given month. And just flooding everywhere. And so I think it really goes to show that it's going to start affecting more than just the biodiversity, but also the people that live in these landscapes. And so something like restoring wetlands can actually really help with mitigating and providing resilience to these systems. So here, anywhere that's in green to red are areas where in Hurricane Sandy, wetlands provided a buffer and a resilience to these systems. And you can pretty much see across New Jersey and most of Long Island and New York, wetlands were predicted and shown to have a buffering effect to these flooding events. And so it really shows the importance of wetland restoration, particularly for us on Long Island. I also want to highlight that native forests, especially oak forests here on Long Island, they don't only just provide carbon dioxide benefits, but they also help with storm runoff and air pollution. They absorb the air pollution, but they also, with these heavy rainfall events, they pull a lot of that water into their system and hold it in their strong soils and root systems. And so I think it's really important to think about inland systems that can help us with these heavy rainfall events as well. And just sort of across the board, nature-based solutions can help across, for wildlife, for people and everything. So here, forest management can reduce the risk of superfires. Restoring wetlands can absorb floodwaters. We can think about different ways that coastal restoration can help benefit human communities, as well as providing more habitats for birds. So I think that it just really goes to show how these natural climate solutions or nature-based solutions can really provide a lot of solutions across the board. And again, just sort of understanding that there are people in the landscape when we go about our conservation efforts. So right now there's a big effort to pull together different protected areas in an effort called 30 by 30, which is protecting 30% of the landscape across the US and across the globe actually by 2030. And so there is an effort to sort of understand where can we protect these areas to help with biodiversity and climate change. But there's also, as again, I said, people in the landscape. This is a map from those areas that I identified earlier that were important for natural climate solutions. And the majority of these lands are on private lands. And so what that shows is that we need to think about ways to work with people that are on the landscape if we want to achieve our conservation initiatives. And so we sort of looked at first, where can we identify human priorities? And so this is identifying where can conservation efforts benefit people that probably don't have the best access to nature. So looking at where people are socially vulnerable based on their household composition and disability, their minority status and language, their housing and transportation, and their socioeconomic status. looking at health disadvantage, looking across multiple different metrics for health to understand, and there's often a relationship between access to nature and health, as well as where are like the nearest protected areas or parks to folks across the ground. So we can sort of identify where could we kind of devote some of this funding for management and protection and conservation and restoration actions that might provide more access to nature for individuals that don't have it, and restore some of the most degraded areas as well that would also improve habitats for birds. So we understand that there's the communities that are disadvantaged, but there's also, as I said, the majority of the lands that we identified are private. So we need to think about a way to work on communities that directly depend on these areas. And in the past, we sort of looked at these folks as probably being a little bit at odds with the conservation work that we want to do, particularly those that are in natural resource industries like forestry and fishing and hunting and farming and agriculture in general. But there's also cultural ties to the land, such as indigenous land, or understanding that if you do go into a suburban or an urban system and you improve the habitat there, you run the risk of actually what's called green gentrification, where you make the area nicer by putting a park in, and then you price out the people that live there and they can no longer afford to live there. And this is something that happened after the hurricanes in Louisiana. Some of the areas that were the hardest hit were kind of restored, but some of the areas that were poorer and were not affected as much by the hurricane were sort of bought up and became too expensive for the people that lived there originally to move back. But one of the things we're doing at Audubon is understanding that we have to sort of work with these folks that live on the ground. We have a conservation ranching initiative where we work with ranchers to work with their land practices so that they what they're doing with their cattle on the ground is providing a biodiversity benefit for birds. And so we're actually certifying their ranches as Audubon certified bird-friendly beef. And the practices they're doing not only help birds and biodiversity, but also helps with carbon mitigation, because native grasses and rotational grazing actually help keep that carbon in the landscape. So again, just sort of understanding across the country, where are our conservation actions that we want to sort of look at for these areas that are important for birds and carbon and protection and restoration, but then understanding here the areas in dark green are where we have those people tied to the landscape for work or for cultural reasons, or in the dark brown, these are areas that there's disadvantaged communities. And here just on Long Island, you can see that we have sort of across the board, we have communities that are at disadvantaged in light brown, but also coincide with areas that are important for birds and carbon. We have areas that have social justice considerations in the dark brown and the green, where we might have to think about ways to work with local partners to achieve the conservation outcomes that we want to. So sort of understanding how we can work with local partners and get to know the people that are in these areas that we want to provide these conservation actions that are beneficial for climate and for biodiversity is going to be really important moving forward. And then I just want to say that there's kind of another part of the solutions is taking action. And like I said, we need to do the natural climate solutions, but we also have to do that fossil fuel mitigation component. And so we need to do a lot. We need to take aggressive action now to make a difference. And part of that, I've shared this before, but I'll share it again. Audubon has this climate action guide where we can think about the different sort of levels that we can take personally to help kind of address this climate change and biodiversity issues. And so one is just really starting the conversation. I think that people don't talk about climate change enough, and it needs to be something that becomes part of our daily conversations. And again, birds are like a really wonderful lens to talk about climate change. It kind of brings it away from this abstract global, hard to understand that it's just polar bears out there, to no, it's birds in my backyard that are already changing and will continue to change. To leading your community and thinking about ways that we can update the grid and rebuilding the machinery in general, to joining a national cause. So that is a website that I'll share out, but there's sort of great tools in there, including what we can do across our community. And I think for Fort Harbor's Audubon Society and for our local community, we're already starting to think about ways that we can sort of plug into our community and take action. And one ways in particular I'll talk about is Our chapter for Harbors Audubon Society has a bird oasis program where we're certifying backyards to that are native plant and eco-friendly practices on the property that provide birds and wildlife over habitat. And so this is actually really important, not only for birds and pollinators, but it's also important for carbon, because native plants are wonderful for thinking about climate change because they are drought tolerant. They do well in the native system. They also tend to have deeper root system that store more carbon, and it's much better than a monoculture of a grass. That grass does really not do anything for carbon mitigation, and it is an ecological desert for birds and for biodiversity. So if you're interested in finding out more, we can share more about the Bird Oasis program. I'll also say that we at the chapter level are heavily involved in the new task force that's across Suffolk County that's creating pollinator pathways across the county, and particularly on county properties, as just another step that we can take to sort of restore locally and provide benefits for birds, for pollinators, and for climate change mitigation. But there's multiple other actions that you can take, and I just really want to highlight that we need to sort of obviously take personal actions, but we need to start championing climate-friendly actions around our town. We can be climate advocates to get involved at the state or the regional level. And we really need to start like putting a dent in these carbon emissions through fossil fuel mitigation, through natural climate solutions, and working together to make sure that we get where we need to go for climate action. Colleges and universities are also examples where we can work. We have Stony Brook University here. I know that often colleges and universities have big carbon footprints. There's an example of Students for a Sustainable Stanford that have taken on the transportation at the California University, partnering with others on a program that offset all the flights taken by the varsity team for the sports. And so just thinking about different ways at the university level that they can address climate change at their local area. So I think that there's different things we can think about as a community to get where we need to go on climate change. And this is my last slide. I just want to sort of end with climate change is clearly a major threat to birds. It's also a threat to people and the places that we share and love. But what we can see is that what's good for birds is also good for stabilizing climate change. And so natural climate solutions can play a huge part in what we do locally to help improve habitats for birds, help mitigate climate change, but that we also have, beyond the opportunity to maintain and manage and conserve these areas, we need to think about who we can work with locally and what partners we can bring on board to address the fact that we share these areas with people, and that we want to make sure that we can move forward with the conservation actions that benefit birds, climate change, and people. And with that, I will open it up to questions, and I'm happy to share any of the resources that I talked about today.
Brooke, thank you so much for a really thorough, comprehensive, and detailed presentation. Wow, very impressive in terms of the information you've provided.
Thanks, John.
A question I have, I guess I could start off is, you touched upon the sea level rise connection with birds, with the piping plover, and I think salt marsh sparrows. Can you amplify a little bit more about the threat and the kind of the extent of the threat that sea level rise poses for birds?
Yeah, so sea level rise is going to be a huge issue. Our coastal birds are particularly at risk. In the original study that I talked about in Survive by Degrees, I didn't touch too much on the threats of sea level rise, but when you sort of look at the combination of the different threats together, sea level rise is going to be a huge issue. For one, particularly in the East Coast, where we've had so much coastal development, there's been so many changes across the land that comes up to the water that it sort of has provided a hard boundary. Like obviously where there's pavement or where there's buildings, you're not going to be able to have changes in the landscape. And with sea level rise, we're not only going to see areas go underwater, but we're also going to see something called marsh migration. And what that means is there's different types of marshland, and they sort of have to move with the levels of the water. And naturally, historically, when there's been sea level rise, they do have been able to some extent shift and sort of adjust to this. But because of that hard boundary of the urbanization and the coastal development, these marshes are not going to be able to move. They're sort of, so that habitat squeezed out from the water and from the land because of these changes. And so areas are just going to be completely converted to either inundated or not be able to shift into a different marsh system that they need to. And so for species like the salt marsh sparrow, they're actually already seeing nestlings getting completely inundated by big rainfall events. And so you have the sea level rise, and then you add the heavy rainfall events, and then you add the hurricanes. It's sort of like all these things on top of each other. In particular for the Northeast, it's like multiple things on top of each other that are going to make it really hard for species like salt marsh sparrow to be able to sort of survive in those conditions.
Right. Well, okay, thank you. We have a few, I think, questions. One was, how can one become involved in a Bird Oasis program? And thank you for a great presentation. That's from Jane. And then I see both Patricia and Joanna have posted information. So Jane, if you go into the chat room, you'll see the information, or where to get the information that can answer your question about how to participate in the Bird Oasis program. A comment from Michael is, I tried to write adopting a plant-based diet is the best thing individuals can do, I guess, for the climate and for the planet. And
yeah, I definitely think a plant-based diet is a great thing that we can do, and I think collectively it would be very meaningful. It's just it's hard to convince the entire global population to do that, and there are some social considerations of there are areas where it's easier to have a plant-based diet than others, and so I think yes, for sure. But I do think that we also need to consider working, like if we're going to have cows in the landscape, then we need to do it in a way that is best as possible. And so that's why I am excited about the conservation ranching program, because like I said, if we have to have cows in the landscape, let's do it in a way that is beneficial as much as possible. But yeah, I think we have a hand up. I see Douglas.
Oh, Doug, okay. Doug, you want to ask a question or make a comment?
Sure. Okay. I guess you can't see me, but you can hear me. Is that right?
Yes. I can hear
okay,
you.
Very good. So let me just first, there I am.
Now I can see you.
I mean, that was just, thank you for a wonderful talk. You touched on so many things. I've been busily writing down questions, and there are more questions than I could possibly ask in this time. But I guess a couple are, one, you touched on the fact that there are other interest groups that basically are basically interested in the same things that we as naturalists are, which is to say maintaining natural landscapes because they use them. And in particular, you mentioned people in forestry and hunters and fishermen. And I'm curious about the extent to which the Audubon has connected with those groups. And as you say, some birders will think it's antithetical to talk to duck hunters, but on the other hand, if it weren't for duck hunters, we wouldn't have most of the national wildlife refuges that we have in this country, like in the upper Midwest, which is the only place you'll find any kind of natural habitat. And so I'm curious about the extent to which that is the case. And then secondly, more locally, just on Long Island, to what extent, given what you described about the issue of salt marshes and sea level rise and so forth, to what extent do you find that there is local buy-in at both the level of people and local politicians to basically looking to the future and maintaining the buffer zone that salt marshes provide?
Yeah, great questions. So the first question, for Audubon, we have a whole working lands program. And so that's part of the conservation ranching program that I talked about, where we're sort of working with ranchers to try to certify their meat in turn for them to do bird-friendly practices. And that program has been growing tremendously. But I agree with you. I think historically, and when I first started getting into conservation, I sort of saw these folks as enemies and that they were the ones causing the problems. And yes, there has been a lot of changes on the landscape, but at the same time, I do think that when you talk to them within a shared language, that they do care about these things. And you're right, we have, I mean, in the 3 billion birds report, waterfowl have done the best because there's been so much money provided to them.
Sure.
And yes, it's because of hunting, but it's sort of like, well, it's really been providing a lot of conservation action. So I think that you need to sort of set aside some of your personal beliefs if you don't agree with hunting or if you don't agree with ranching but we also need to work with these folks because that's where we need to do the work. It's all on private lands. We can't just say, I'm going to protect these areas and kick people off their land. So we need to find a way to work with them to.
And they also have more clout than we have.
Yeah.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah, so I know that our seabirds program does work with the fisheries. I don't know a ton about that. Like I focus most of my research on land birds, but I know we work with fisheries with our seabirds and our coastal teams. And I know that we're actively talking. We haven't done a lot in pure agriculture, but with like the conservation ranching and some of our other working lands programs. So I think it is something that Audubon is going to continue to explore because we understand if we want to achieve what we need to achieve, then we're going to have to work with folks that are also on the landscape. So that's for your first question. Your second question, I think maybe John or somebody else on the call from Four Harbors might be able to answer that better than me on what we're doing locally. I know there has been some restoration efforts in parts of Long Island and our wetlands, but I don't know, John, if you want to speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Good question, Doug. I guess I'd answer it by saying the response by local governments varied on Long Island. Town of Brookhaven, for example, has been very active at dealing with the issue of sea level rise, and the domestic marshlands area is a place that we're showcasing for the work that we're doing. If you think of William Floyd Parkway east over to the Forge River, that coastal marsh area that includes the William Floyd estate, and then all the marshlands to the west of that, the county, the town, and the state have been buying hundreds of parcels. Now, keep in mind, most of these parcels are postage stamp size because they were old file subdivision maps that never, houses, most cases didn't get built. So we've been buying that, and we've got the town, I can tell you, for the land acquisition staff, we've got a very aggressive outreach program with property owners down there requesting or urging donations. And if you take a look at the GIS of that part of the county and the town, you'll see that it's one of the few places on Long Island that will be able to achieve what Brooke was talking about, where you'll be able to have marshlands that will be able to migrate northward as the sea level does rise. They won't bump up against some hardened structure and then wink out, so to speak, but they'll be able to actually move and replace perhaps the coastal forests that are there. So I encourage you to take a look at that. And that really serves as a model. We've gotten actually national attention from the work that we're doing there. I'm happy to share with you more detailed information if you like about that. The other thing I'll add about this is that the governor's Hochul's $4 billion Environmental Bond Act proposal has got significant funding for coastal resiliency and land acquisition in a coastal zone that will be made available if, of course, voters this fall approve that very significant bond act. So just a few things.
Thanks to both of you.
See if they have any. Oh, we have a question from Michael. Can plants have adverse effect when growing where there should be plants as far as climate change?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question, and there's sort of two different ways to look at it. I think if a plant, so plants take longer to, generally trees, take longer than something like a bird to respond to climate change because they have to sort of shift through whatever their life cycle is through seeds or how they're going to sort of move. And in general, like a forest is going to take a lot longer to move than a bird might find a new area. So they have to sort of sit in place for a while and just sort of, they can start to not do well over time because the conditions are getting worse. But a tree can't just pick up and move. And so it's more about how that population shifts through reproduction and moving into new areas. So it can start to like not do well in areas as the climate becomes worse for them. But you can also have problems where you introduce a plant outside of its native range where it could become invasive. I mean, we see that a lot with non-native plants, but you can also have native plants that if you plant them in a new area can sort of go out of control and take over. And there's sort of this tricky line that there's something called assisted migration or assisted colonization, where the idea is that we want to sort of move species to help them keep up with these range shifts that they're supposed to anticipate. So there are certain species of plants that like, maybe if we move them now, they'll do better and establish themselves by the time climate changes, but then there's also the risk of them sort of taking over that area. But it's sort of, there's going to be this question as climate change proceeds, what is that sort of native, non-native line as we're going to have, we're seeing things shift. Obviously, if something comes from another country and it's moved in, that's non-native, but what about something from Virginia that is going to be in New York in like 20 years with climate change? When is that non-native anymore? So I don't know if I answered your question, but I think that it's sort of suffer in place or shift and adapt in new areas, and it can be detrimental on either side.
Great. Any other question? I think that was the last question I see in the chat box. Does anybody else have any maybe closing question or comment? We're almost at 8:45. So I'd like to, I guess, begin to wrap up.
Can I just ask just something that follows on that?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. So one of the, when you were describing, for example, the wood thrush and that it's moving northward, and you sort of, projected what the suitable range would be for wood thrush in another, 40 or 50 years, to what extent are you assuming that in fact the plant composition, the species composition will be suitable in the areas that are going to be climatically suitable for the wood thrush? So this relates to this last issue, because wood thrushes, won't live in coniferous forests, and so will those forests that will be in climatically suitable areas, how likely it is that they will have turned over and become suitable in terms of plant species composition. And I suspect, of course, that given the lifespan of trees, that you're going to see a big lag between the standing species composition of a forest and what the expected composition would be when it comes into equilibrium with the changed climate.
Yeah, there's definitely going to be big lags, and it's even seen within like animals. Like, so birds are going to respond differently than salamanders would, or turtles. So I think like there is going to be a lag, and there's going to be very different biotic interactions in the future. Sure. So what composition of species we have now is going to be very different in the future, and it's going to be really interesting to see what plays out and who sort of wins. I will say that with our models, we did include change in broad vegetation type and how that's projected to change in the future. So some of the areas that become no longer suitable for wood thrush are because of changes in projected vegetation, but those are just sort of we're seeing, it's called the trailing edge effect. So the trailing edge effect is where at the bottom, or in the northern hemisphere, the southern part of the range is going to sort of become unsuitable, but things are sort of going to persist there, and like eventually the populations are going to be affected so much that they decline, as opposed to the northern or leading edge, where it's really obvious to see changes because like a species wasn't there and now it is. And so it's that trailing edge where we're going to see a lot of problems, where things are sort of declining over time because conditions are becoming worse. And then in the leading edge, are those things going to be there when they need them? That's the question. And if they're there already, then that's great. But if they're not, that's why those blue areas that are potentially to become newly suitable are such a question mark, because once it gets there, what species is going to be there competing it? What food is going to be there? Like specifically the local characteristics, it's really a gamble as to what's going to happen. So it's going to be really interesting to see moving forward.
Great. Okay. Any last questions? If not, I want to thank Brooke so much for the presentation. Again, both highly informative and highly detailed. Well, you gave us a lot of kind of food for thought, and much of it I did find a little depressing, to be honest. It was also uplifting because you made it clear that there are things that we can do to ameliorate the problem. So the issue is one that we can deal with and address and make meaningful contribution towards. So to that extent, it's something that we should all strive to do. And I think that's your presentation. That was kind of a theme in your presentation. So thank you, Brooke, so much for the presentation, and thank everybody for participating. Okay. And,
thank you. Thanks for sharing your evening with me.
Yeah. So, okay.
Thanks,
Bye.
Brooke.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Say good night, everybody. Good night.